Penguin Random House Audio presents James Monroe, A Life, by Tim Mcgrath. Read for you by Arthur Morey. Prologue. On the stifling moonlit night of August 24th, 1814, a rider, his clothes dirty, his boots mud-caked, smelling of sweat and gun smoke, stopped his mount after crossing the Potomac from the city of Washington into northern Virginia. Looking back across the river, he saw flames rising into the sky as several large fires consumed the marble, brick, stone, and wooden buildings that, just minutes earlier, had officially housed the documents, representatives, senators, judges, and President of the United States. All that week the rider had been in the saddle, barely stopping long enough to sleep. He was 56 years old, far too long in the tooth to be leading a scouting party, but by now he had put himself in advance of the lines of both military and political battles so often it had become habit. Just the previous day he had been one of the first to arrive at a Maryland crossroads called Bladensburg, only hours ahead of an enemy force that intended to do its part to destroy the nation he had devoted his life to preserving. This morning had begun with the quixotic hope that more than 6,000 poorly trained American militiamen could beat a heavily outnumbered force of British regulars, hardened by years of fighting against Napoleon Bonaparte's empire. Instead, the redcoats sent the green Americans fleeing from the battlefield for their very lives. With the enemy marching unopposed toward the nation's capital, the rider returned to Washington. Only after the president and most of his cabinet had escaped did he slip out of the city in the dark, just as the first British troops entered the near-empty streets, torches in hand. Within minutes, flames were licking the walls of the president's mansion. It was a fitting end to the most humiliating day in the young country's history. It was not the first time this aging volunteer had seen an American city burned during a war with the British. In 1776, he was an 18-year-old shave-tail lieutenant when his regiment marched up Harlem Heights in New York City to join the Continental Army. Hours later, he watched in horror as General George Washington's troops were routed by British land and naval forces. Days later, the city of New York, which Washington so desperately wanted to keep out of British hands, was set afire. Now that once young lieutenant was reliving the same nightmare. The War of 1812, in its third year, was not going well for the Americans. Morale was low among soldier, sailor, and citizen alike. The conflict some called the Second War of Independence was being lost. That night, from the safety of Virginia, President James Madison and his retinue watched atop their horses as the sky went from black to a spreading reddish-orange. To Attorney General Richard Rush, it looked like the whole city were on fire, bursts of flame mounting up high in the dark horizon. 40 miles away, at Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, a young Army private compared the rising and falling conflagration to the aurora borealis. Despite overwhelming emotions of loss and shame, and the heart-rending worry over the safety of his wife, Dolly, the president knew he had a crucial decision to make. His Secretary of War, John Armstrong, Jr., already unpopular with many in Madison's cabinet for both his overbearing approach and his lust for Madison's job, had repeatedly scoffed at the idea that the British would target Washington. Well, they had. Soon the public would be clamoring for either Armstrong's head or Madison's. Earlier defeats had been bad enough, but the capture and burning of the Capitol was one embarrassment too many for Armstrong to explain away. He had to go. And with Napoleon exiled on the island of Elba, Great Britain could now send seasoned troops by the thousands across the Atlantic, perhaps even led by the Duke of Wellington himself. Do that, and the American war, a veritable sideshow compared to the years of carnage in Europe, would soon end, another British triumph in the history books. Madison had to do something, and the change in the War Department's leadership was the most obvious of his limited options. Selecting a new man for the job, selecting the right man for the job, would be both a political and public gesture, a visible sign of defiance that would let Madison's countrymen take a collective deep breath and continue fighting. And the president believed he had the best man to take Armstrong's place. If this gentleman decided to succeed Armstrong, he would have days at best, hours more likely, to begin reorganizing the army, help get the defense of Baltimore underway before the victorious enemy arrived after burning Washington, send word to General Andrew Jackson, hundreds of miles south in Alabama, to march his men to New Orleans, now the obvious southern target of the British war machine, and somehow find funds to keep the war going at a time when the government treasury was rock-bottom broke. If he failed at any one of these, the war, and perhaps the country itself, would be lost. But Madison knew the character of his choice. When General George Washington's Continentals and the nation they had been fighting for were at their most desperate hour, he had volunteered to help lead the advance guard that crossed the icy Delaware in a snowstorm, hours before the tattered remnants of the army followed. Years later, at President Washington's request, he had taken his wife and little daughter to France, serving as America's minister while the reign of terror still devoured Paris. When President Thomas Jefferson needed someone he could trust to secure a land deal that would double the size of the United States, this man returned to Europe and spent several years on diplomatic assignments in Spain and Great Britain. After Madison, as Jefferson's Secretary of State, dismissed this man's efforts to stop the press gangs of King George's Navy from seizing American sailors on the open seas, he had returned to the United States, convinced that their decades-long friendship was finished. Yet later, when President Madison asked him to become his Secretary of State, this man agreed to serve his country once again. In fact, no one else had ever held so many military, political, and diplomatic positions over a lifetime of service to the United States of America. He personified the description from the book of Job about the old war horse. He cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. Yes, the shrewd and desperate Madison knew how this man would answer his request, regardless of the peril, sacrifice, and consequences. Of course, James Monroe would say yes. Chapter 1. Rebellious Colonists and Disorderly Collegians. We then rallied and returned to the action. James Monroe. Like most landowning families in colonial Virginia, the Monroes traced their presence in the New World to an Old World adventurer. In 1314, during the Battle of Bannockburn, when a desperate army of Scotsmen thrashed King Edward II's forces, winning a brief respite of independence from England, a Monroe, then spelled M-U-N-R-O, fought against the tyrant crown. By the 1640s, Scottish troops found themselves fighting for the English king, Charles I, not against him, over the expulsion of Presbyterians from Parliament by Oliver Cromwell. At the Battle of Preston in 1648, Charles's forces, Captain Andrew Monroe among them, were soundly defeated by Cromwell's Roundheads, ending the efforts of Charles's cavaliers to keep him on the throne. Charles I lost his head, and Monroe lost his homeland. He returned to the family homestead, Foulis Castle, before departing for the New World. The exiled Monroe somehow obtained a tract of land in the colony of Virginia and found passage on a ship carrying other Scots across the Atlantic. The colonists of Virginia were the precursors of the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?